Alright, everybody, we are continuing talking a little bit more about tissues this week, as well as the rest of the skeletal system, including the joints. So we are going to be covering quite a few chapters this week. So we're going to be doing chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. That sounds like a lot, I know, but chapters 6 and 7 are talking about the axial and appendicular skeletons, and the bulk of those chapters really focuses a lot on just learning the different bones within each of those parts of the skeleton, which has been the bulk of our focus in lab material up until this point. So we're only going to just very briefly touch on those two chapters, and we're going to spend most of our time talking about chapters 5 and 8. So bone tissue and then joints. All right. And please bear with me this week. I am recovering from bronchitis, so it is a little bit challenging to still talk for long periods of time right now, but I'm going to do the best I can, and we're going to get through this. All right. So, chapter 5, we are going to look at the functions of bones. We're going to learn how bones are classified, so we have different types of bones in the body. We are going to talk about how bone is formed and how it develops over time, how it repairs itself after an injury, a fracture, and then we are going to briefly look at the effect of exercise, nutrition, and hormones on bone tissues, because those are really, really big components. All right. So starting out in section 2 with the functions of the skeletal system, so we are going to look a little bit more closely at bone and cartilage versus last week's material, and then we are going to look at those functions of the skeletal system very briefly. This section is pretty short because there's just not a lot of detail that we need to go into here. So our skeletal system is made out of bone, also known as osseous tissue, and then cartilage. So bone, like we talked about last week, this is a solid supportive connective tissue, and then cartilage is also supportive connective tissue, and in this case it is semi-rigid, so it does have a lot more flexibility than bone tissue does, but it's also not super flexible like other tissues of the body. So overall, the skeletal system is going to help support the body, so that is what gives us the ability to stand and sit upright. Otherwise, we would just kind of be a heap of soft tissues without that bony skeleton. It's going to facilitate movement, so without those bones for our muscles to attach to, then there's really not a lot of stuff they can do as far as movement goes. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about how that works in a future chapter when we talk about muscles and the lever system that functions in our body. Our skeletal system is also going to help protect our internal organs, so like our thoracic cage, the ribs, sternum, and vertebrae are going to protect our heart and lungs from a lot of damage, and then our skull will protect our brain, so 3 really important organs, obviously. Those are 3 of our 5 vital organ systems in the body that without those we will not survive. So really important to have protection for those. Bone is also where we are producing all of the blood cells in our body, so we'll get into a little bit of detail about that, just kind of where that's located, but we'll talk more about blood cell development later on in the semester, about the halfway point when we actually do our chapter on blood specifically. And then last but not least, our skeletal system is going to store and release both minerals and fat. So our bones do function as a little bit of a storage system for these things. So we're just looking here at how our skull is going to help protect our brain. So this is the skull overlaid on top of the brain, so we can see the eye sockets right there. This is where the nasal cavity would be. And so we really need that bone to help protect our brain. There are going to be other connective tissues and some fluid in between the bones and the actual brain tissue itself that's going to help provide a little bit more cushioning, so that we are not getting the brain hitting right up against the skull during normal daily movement. More extreme movements, traumatic injuries and stuff are still going to have that happen because that's a very thin layer of cushioning that we have there, but it does help with our normal day-to-day life. Alright, so we're going to get into the first part of section 3, bone structure. The other parts of this will get broken up into other videos. But overall, for section 3, we are going to learn anatomical features of a bone. We're just going to touch on that really briefly since, again, that's something we've been talking a lot about with lab material so far. Same thing goes with examples of bone markings. We've done a lot of that in lab, and then we're going to look in detail at the histology of bone tissue. So what does bone tissue look like under a microscope? We're going to compare compact and spongy bone, what their purposes are, the structures that make up each of those, and stuff like that. And then we are going to talk about how bones are provided with nutrients and how they have nerves going into that bony tissue. Alright, so the general anatomy of a bone, so gross anatomy, there are 3 main parts of a long bone. Long bones are not the only type of bone in the body, but they do make up a pretty significant portion of our bones. We'll talk about the other types a little bit later, but for long bones, which are things like the humerus and femur and the ulna, radius, tibia, fibula, stuff like that, even the bones of the fingers and palm of the hand, so all of those metacarpals as well as the metatarsals and stuff like that, those are all long bones. And so those 3 parts are the epiphysis, the metaphysis, and diaphysis. And so the epiphysis, this is the very proximal and distal ends of the bone, and it is made out of spongy bone tissue specifically. The metaphysis is going to be the narrower space that kind of exists between the epiphysis and diaphysis, and it is going to contain something called the epiphyseal plate. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then the diaphysis contains something called the medullary cavity. So this is our graphic of this anatomy of a long bone. And so you can see up here, we're looking at the femur in this image. So up here where we have the head of the femur and the neck and those trochanters, this is the proximal epiphysis. And then down here towards where we're going to have that knee joint is that distal epiphysis. Alright, so those 2 opposite ends, again, those are going to be made out of spongy bone tissue. We'll talk more about what spongy and compact bone are in another video, but that is what's making up the epiphysis. And then we have our metaphysis right here below that. So this little section following the epiphysis, both proximal and distal ends, so that's just a small section. Again, our epiphyseal plate or epiphyseal line is going to be there, and that epiphyseal line is where we actually have a thin layer of hyaline cartilage during childhood, and a little bit into early adulthood. It's most prominent during childhood though. And that hyaline cartilage, like I mentioned last week with the connective tissues video, the function of that is to give kind of a template on which to build out bone tissue. And so this is the region where we are building out new bone tissue and growing these bones into longer and larger bones as we grow through childhood, and again into very early adulthood. It's about in the 20s where that epiphyseal plate, the cartilage has completely been used up, and so this is actually a way that anthropologists and medical professionals can get a rough idea of the age of a particular skeleton is by looking at that epiphyseal plate and seeing how much cartilage is still left. And so if there's no cartilage left at all, they know it's going to be older than a certain point in time, because most people are going to be completely done growing by their early to mid-20s, depending on each person's individual genetics. And then in between those parts is the diaphysis, so this is kind of that central part of these long bones. On the femur, this is where that linea aspera is going to be located on the posterior side of the bone. And so this is going to be broken up into some different substructures. So this is where we're starting to see some more red bone marrow pop up, and then some different layers like the endosteum and medullary cavity. And then we're also going to see some yellow bone marrow closer to kind of the central part of this. That red bone marrow is going to be located kind of up here a little bit more, and somewhere in this region will transition from red bone marrow, which is where we are producing blood cells, to the yellow bone marrow, which is fat storage. All right. And so these are all the different parts. We're also going to have more compact bone down here in the diaphysis, which is going to be very, very dense and hard and durable versus the spongy bone tissue up here at the proximal and distal ends, which makes sense for that kind of main part of these long bones. Is we need a lot more compact, strong, durable bone. All right. And so surrounding that compact bone is going to be these layers of other connective tissues, the endosteum and periosteum. So those are just going to kind of keep the different structures within the bony tissue together, and also help provide an attachment point for tendons and ligaments. So you can see down here this periosteum, this is kind of on the outer surface, and so tendons and ligaments are actually going to blend with that periosteum, where they are connecting and anchoring into that bone tissue. So that just helps give that attachment site for tendons and ligaments, as well as other tissues in the body. And then the endosteum is where we are looking to see a lot of growth. So this is bone growth, repair, and remodeling is occurring primarily in the endosteum. End, that prefix means inside, and then oste is bone, so endosteum is inside of bone. So that's where we're doing our growth and repair and stuff like that. And then again, that periosteum, this is a connective tissue layer on the outside of the bone, where we are going to be able to anchor in with tendons and ligaments, but it does also help play a role in bone growth and repair and stuff like that. Both of these are going to have vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels that help provide nutrients to the compact bone tissue. And so this all has different functions, these different parts. And then again, that medullary cavity, that is where we have that yellow bone marrow, which is a site of fat storage in our bones. The ends are going to have that articular cartilage, helping to cushion the joints, so that they are not rubbing bone directly on bone, because that is very, very painful, and it does happen as we get older, but we really want to try to keep that cartilage in as good shape as possible for as long as we possibly can. And we will continue talking about some of these other parts in the next video. Just don't want to make this video too terribly long, so we'll continue this in the next video.